the meaning we give to words mean a lot. The meaning we give to specific words are going to change your perception of reality 180 degrees. What do I mean by that? People have the tendency to put together things and to name them with different names, but yet the same thing. This is the case, for example, for the word religion or the word spiritual. Now, people think that what is religious equals to what is spiritual, and what is spiritual equals to what is religious. I would dare to say that it is not so. Absolutely not so, because you could be a religious person and not to be a spiritual person. What's the difference then between these two things? You see, the human mind is composed by different elements within it. We have, for example, the conscious part, then we have the subconscious part, which Freud classified as repressed elements from the conscious part through the course of life. Therefore, they become some form of autopilot due to personal experiences. Now, Jung would go further in this and say that there is something which is called collective subconscious. What is this collective subconscious? It's actually a form of subconscious which is equal for all humanity. All of us, we don't like snakes. All of us, we imagine that evil is characterized as a dragon. All of us, we understand some things to be intrinsically good and some things to be intrinsically evil. Now, this perception of reality, it is common to all humanity. It is not culture linked. Okay, this is what Jung would call collective subconscious. While when it is culturally linked, then it is part of the normal subconscious, because it is something that you experienced in your life, in your childhood more precisely, and this became a part of you and a part of who you are. Now, we have to understand the difference between a collective subconscious and rational part from a human perspective and from a divine perspective. The same three elements I mentioned are part of the experience of humanity here on earth. But the same three things can be changed. You would say, how? Well, this is exactly where the spiritual component comes in. We are a spirit in the sense that we are entities that live in this body, and this body is an intrinsic part of our soul. Now, our body plus the spirit equals soul. Okay? So, my identity of who I am coming from the spiritual source, plus added to this body, which carries with it, where did I get this body? I got it from my parents. Where did they get it? From their parents. Where did they get it? From their parents, and so on and so on. So this body comes from this earth. The spirit does not come from this earth. It's from another dimension, which we will call a spiritual dimension. Now, this spirit lives within this body for a certain period of time. When this is detached, then I cease to exist in this dimension, in this form. Whether I exist in another dimension, whether I exist together with the source, with the lack of consciousness, this we don't know because we have not been on the other side. But what we know is that since people don't come back from there and there is no contact and correlation between us and them, that means that we are ceasing our existence in the disconnection between body and spirit. Now, the rational part is the usage of logic, human logic, which is constructed based on the human experience on earth, which is every time that this and this are so, this will be the result. It's almost like a mathematical way of understanding life. 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, this is rational. Then the human mind has as well within it an emotional component. This emotional component has with it the strong linking to the subconscious part. Okay, so the emotional part, it's rooted in the subconscious. The rational part is rooted in the conscious. When you're in a crisis situation, when you have no time to think, you are not going to calculate things from a rational perspective, but you will calculate them from an emotional perspective. Now, whether you have trained your emotion, whether you have trained your subconscious to be even emotionally rational or only emotional is up to you, but you are going to react according to that. So it is happening that when you need to take a decision, according to the involvement of the conscious or the subconscious, you're going to have different elements kicking in. So if you would be buying with emotions, your subconscious will push you to buy. If you would be buying with reason, then it would be your rational part pushing you to buy that element because you've calculated all the pros and the cons. Now, this is exactly paralleled to the divine conscious and the divine subconscious. What do I mean by that? We could say that the human mind, in the sense of the human existence within this body, expresses naturally with a natural conscious and a natural subconscious. Now there is a supernatural conscious and a supernatural subconscious which can be linked to these two, keeping them subject and living instead of them. Apostle Paul would define this as the death of the flesh and the living of the spirit. So what is this that Paul calls flesh? It's nothing else than the rational part and the emotional part of the human being, which is slowly but surely put to death by another element which is taking its place. And that element is a spiritual element, which I will call it a feeling element more than emotions. It's something different. I tend to classify them as feelings because it's something that is deep, it is long-term, almost like eternal concept as far as we can understand eternal, while emotions are superficial and short-term. Not superficial in the intensity, but superficial in the analysis of perception of reality, without keeping in consideration the hierarchical structure of who we are in the light of the universe. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Emotions will have the tendency to put the individual in the center of the process of analysis. A true anthropocentric approach, anthropos, human, man, from the Greek, a true anthropocentric approach of extreme humanism. So man is in the center, whatever man wants, whatever man feels, whatever makes man to feel God, it's what emotions will push you towards. While in the spiritual heart, because these two, okay, it can be called one heart or the flesh, the human heart, and you have the spiritual heart, which is the spirit conscious part and the spirit subconscious part. Now, the spiritual part will make you to see the hierarchical structure of the universe, not in an extreme anthropocentric way where extreme humanism is at the center, but where the source of life is at the center. And the source of life is equivalent to the source of the spirit that we are. Okay, so it cannot be linked to something which is mortal or something which is not eternal. So if we put in the center something that is eternal, for religious people we will call it God, then we can base our perception of reality based on that God. Okay, so in the human heart, man is in the center and thinks to be God. In the divine heart, God is in the center and man is in need of God. If these things are not clear, you are going to go through life being chronically deceived by emotions, which will tell you that you are God, therefore you have to be angry because you deserve not to be treated like that. Or you deserve that others obey your commands. Now, there will be no problem for others to obey your commands and to be all this to be righteous if you were in the hierarchical structure in that position. But if you are something which you are not, or you think to be something which you are not, you deceive yourself. Therefore, you're playing a game, giving in your rules of the game, which do not correspond to reality, and you're expecting a positive outcome of the game. This is not how life works. So you have this human heart compared to the spiritual heart. When the human heart is put down, as Apostle Paul calls it, I die daily, then the spiritual heart can take over and the human stops existing. Now, this process is a continual daily process, not something that you're just going to do once and for all. Although the sacrifice of Christ was done once for all, the process of internalization of that sacrifice is not done once for all, but is done daily. And through this process, which is called the process of sanctification, what is going to happen is it's going to become a new creature out of a person. You have the human heart dying because the rational and the emotional elements dim compared to the rational and emotional elements of a new perception of reality, a theocentric perception of reality. Now, the problem would be, how do I determine what is that God? Because one could say, I think God is like that, therefore we have to structure reality based on this perception. Well, the determination of what God is, it's something that has to be linked to the perception of that spiritual element. Is that spiritual element in itself which will show you the way? It's like an internal voice which will lead you, yet a different voice from the emotional one, which is also a voice that leads you. But you will learn through life to differentiate between these two voices, and you will understand which voice to follow and which voice not to follow. And we're not talking about the rational part, okay, of the two elements. We're talking about the emotional part of the two elements, the subconscious part. Emotions on this side and feelings on this side. Emotions short term and a lie, and feelings truth and long term. Okay, it's almost like talking about falling in love and love. They are two different things. One is an emotional expression, the other one is a spiritual expression. Okay, I would call it a feeling, a deep feeling. Okay, nevertheless, this concept of love has to be expressed first towards the source of love, because it is love itself, and it can be reflected to the other elements of creation. It cannot be taken from other elements because they do not have the source of it. They are also dependent from God. So in this dependency, everybody is fed by the same source, while in the emotional field, everybody thinks to be the source and thinks to be a source for himself and for others. And if he thinks to be the source, therefore he thinks that also others are the source. Therefore he can suck from others as well. And this is the process of binding with people so that people become your love source. This is absolutely wrong. One of the worst things a person can do in life, it is to bind yourself to something which is not the source. By so doing, you are, first of all, denying that there is a true source. Second, thinking yourself to be the source. Third, thinking that others can be your source. All of these three things are a lie, which can be understood only if you understand the rational part of the hierarchical structure of the universe. Okay, if you do not analyze that, you will continue believing a lie. Now, these two things, they are essential elements to define what is religiousness and what is spirituality. A religious life is a life that is based on the human heart. A spiritual life is based on the spiritual heart. What's the difference? You can perfectly be a religious person, understanding that there is something superior to us in the rational sense, yet in the emotional part of you, which is the subconscious part, believing actually that you are the center of the universe. This dichotomy, this conflict between what you think in your rational part and what you think in your emotional part are not evident to us unless we search deep and we try to analyze them. Because the word subconscious, it means that it's under consciousness, so it is unconscious. Okay, so if something is unconscious, how can you be conscious of something that is unconscious? You can't unless you analyze by the fruits. So what you have to do is to use that element of rationality, which is also within the human heart, which can help you to draw back and to observe yourself from outside and to try to deeply understand why you do things. Now, this level of self-awareness is not common. You have to really almost force yourself to do it, because it's not natural for the human heart to ask himself questions that can be detrimental to that hierarchical structure which is self-constructed within the human heart, so that it can be advantageous for himself. So you draw back and you try to ask yourself, why do I really do good? Okay, rationally we would all understand that good is good. Why do I really do good? Do I do good because I think that by doing good I get a merit, I get a profit? If I think so, I think to be the center of this process, while I'm not. So, if you do not get out of this concept of religiousness, you will live a life thinking to be a devout Christian or devout whatever, Muslim or Hindu or whatever that has a recognition of a hierarchical divine structure. And yet at the end of your journey, you will discover that all of the motivations for which your heart was actually doing what you wanted him to do, or what you wanted to do, was selfish. So how do we get out of this situation? If every good we do is selfish, how do we make it unselfish? There is absolutely no way to make it so, unless we completely change heart. And this transformation of heart is a divine process. It's not a human process. It's not something that the rational part and the emotional part can accomplish. The rational part can help you to understand the emotional part and to dig in your subconscious for the only purpose of recognition of what we would call in religious terms sin, which is a distorted perception of reality. Distorted perception of reality, missing the point in Hebrew. Okay, so the rational part can help you to understand that your emotions are having a trajectory which is wrong, not beneficial for you in the long term. Yet it may seemingly be beneficial, but only in the short term, and only for the body and not for the spirit. And being the body mortal and non-eternal, why would you invest in something which is non-eternal and mortal? Okay, so once you arrive to that, there is no way out. You need a savior. And this savior need is expressed in the groaning for this situation, in the mourning for this situation. So blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who mourn for their condition. Once you arrive to the realization that there is nothing good you can do, even the best you do it for selfish motives, then you mourn for your condition because there is no way out. It's almost at the verge of suicide because there is nothing that you can do to make yourself good. And there salvation comes, because it's in that moment where your heart starts feeling the need of reviving into something else. So you take the human heart and you change it to the divine heart. And this divine heart starts growing and taking space within you. And your rational part is now changed and transformed. And your emotional part is exchanged with the spiritual part. So these two elements work on the subconscious part, emotions and feelings. These two things, they work on an unconscious level. So you are not perceiving it, but if you dig deep enough, you can make more and more of that conscious. And so this is called the process of sanctification. It may look very complex. It is actually not that complex. It is a process which has been taught for millennia in the different cultures. The problem is that every time that this is taught, you arrive to a condition of institutionalization of this process. And when this process is institutionalized and you lose the spiritual element, you are left again with the human heart, rational and emotional part, which can perfectly build up a structure, a religious structure, and form a church, and run all sorts of ceremonies, and you think to be doing the right. The problem is, the motivation for which you do the right is wrong. And there is nothing good that can come out when the motivation of doing something good is wrong. It would be far better to have the motivation of doing something good, and yet having a wrong outcome, than to have the motivation of doing something good with a wrong motivation. So, let me rephrase it. Happiness or blessedness comes from a proper perception of reality. Let me use a paraphrased version of the words of Christ, of how he put it. He said, happiness comes from having a humble attitude. If you feel your need of God and trust Him, you have the kingdom of God within you. Happiness comes from grieving for your sin. Confess your sin and you will be forgiven, and peace will spring up in your soul. Okay, this is exactly the process I told to you about. It's the rational part helping you to understand what is going on in your emotional component and the motivation for your action. And therefore, you can perceive sin, and when you see it, you grieve for that condition. Happiness comes from being submissive. When you acknowledge God as the source of life and abilities, you will feel heaven's joy. One day, people like this will fill the whole earth. Happiness comes from longing to do what is right. Those who do right will have an inner satisfaction that nothing else can give. Now, this need of righteousness, this hunger and thirst for righteousness, as the King James puts it, is actually the recognition that it needs to come from outside redemption. Redemption cannot come from inside, being the condition of the rational and emotional component of the human heart is unable to heal itself. Happiness comes from being compassionate and forgiving. People will remember your loving kindness and return the same to you. In other words, your heart is changed. Your heart becomes now divine in this process, after having acknowledged that the source is outside of you. So that the kingdom can live within you, you have to take it from outside and put it in. You cannot take it from inside and put it out if you first don't take it from out and put it in. Happiness comes to those with pure heart and motives. Such people will one day have the privilege of seeing God and talking to Him face to face. Happiness comes from being a peacemaker, for such are God's children. Now, all of this process that I described, they're called the Beatitudes. It's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. It's the introduction of the ministry of Jesus. In other words, it's the first great public speech of Jesus, where he starts at these points. And he arrives through a series of conversion steps, which we just described, arriving to the point of peace. Now, for you to be able to give peace to others outside of you and around you, you have to have peace within you. And to have that peace within you, you have to go through these steps. There is no other way, for peace is not produced within the human heart, but peace is only the product of the spiritual heart, true peace. And once you arrive to that element of spiritual peace, whatever happens around you, it's not a problem anymore, because circumstances are not what leads you, but you start having an independent life from circumstances. Whether you live or whether you die, whether you're in prison or whether you are free, whether you suffer or whether you rejoice, you are still in peace. This is a very, very ambitious element for a human. Well, it is so ambitious that it is impossible for a human. That's why it is the spiritual component that has to come in to give you that peace. And now once you have that peace, let's see what it says. Happiness comes from being treated badly for doing what is right. In the sense that even when they treat you bad for doing what is right, and you know that that is right because you do it for the right motive, you will not suffer that mistreatment. You will not consider that against you, for it is not against you, but it is against the source of right or the source of good. Just remember that no matter what happens, your peace and your place in heaven is secure. Strangely enough, you will find yourself blessed even when people insult you, persecute you, and lie about you because you have accepted me. When this happens, be glad, because it shows that your name is written in heaven and that your reward will be waiting for you there. Remember, the prophets were treated no differently. This is such an amazing way of introducing a speech of the ministry of Christ. It's almost like describing all the steps from the rational to the emotional to the subconscious part, the transformation of the spirit, the hunger and thirst for the spirit to transform the human heart, and then this spiritual peace and bliss which is able to endure all circumstances. This is the goal of Christianity. This is the goal of a spiritual life. So, do you see the difference between religiousness and spirituality? If you don't find that peace in religious people, remember they're only religious, they're not spiritual. And if you find that peace in somebody, whether he claims to be religious or non-religious, it doesn't matter. He is a spiritual person. Because he has made that spirit to work within him, not even knowing about the process and ceremonies of religiousness. So it is with reality. So my wish for all of us, it is that we might differentiate what is spiritual and what is religious. We might differentiate what is a selfish motive and an unselfish motive of within our heart and within our spirit, so that our hearts can be transformed radically from within, in the sense that the motive that comes from within has to be purified, but this purification process comes from without. There is no way from within to self-transform the heart. You need a savior. You need a redeemer. This is affirmed through history and through all spiritual traditions of the past millennia. You have to take this spiritual source from outside. And my wish, it is for all of us to go through this journey and to analyze ourselves, whether we are religious people or we are spiritual. And if we are still religious, let us ask ourselves, why do we do even the good that we do?